to a humanitarian emergency. Crossings into Gaza have been closed and power shortages are affecting water supplies. Hundreds of buildings and homes have been destroyed, damaged, or rendered uninhabitable. Airstrikes have damaged several hospitals, which were already short of supplies due to years of debilitating closures exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The fighting has left thousands of Palestinians homeless and forced over 50,000 people to leave their homes and seek shelter in UNRWA schools, mosques, and other places with little access to water, food, hygiene, or health services. I was horrified by reports that 9 members of one family were killed in Al-Shati refugee camp. If there is a hell on earth, it is the lives of children in Gaza today. The destruction of media offices and the killing of a journalist in Gaza are extremely concerning. Journalists must be able to carry out their essential work, including in conflict zones, without fear of attack and harassment. They must be protected and respected. I'm deeply distressed by damage to United Nations facilities in Gaza. United Nations premises are inviolable, including during armed conflict. Humanitarian installations must be respected and protected. United Nations agencies and our partners continue to provide aid to the people of Gaza. UNRWA is providing drinking water, sanitation, and electricity generators for those sheltering in its schools, while the World Food Programme has provided electronic vouchers to 74,000 people in Gaza. And the Secretary General Mark Lowcock and I will launch a full humanitarian appeal for funding as soon as possible. And meanwhile, to meet immediate needs, I'm working on an allocation from the Central Emergency Response Fund, and the humanitarian coordinator intends to release $14 million from the Humanitarian Fund for the occupied Palestinian territories. I urge donors to follow through on the pledges they have made. Access for humanitarian goods is paramount. Attacks by militant groups on areas surrounding crossing points are unacceptable. At the same time, Israel has a duty to allow and facilitate rapid and unhindered access for humanitarian aid, including food, fuel, and medical supplies into Gaza. Excellencies, meanwhile, rockets fired by militants in Gaza have reached as far as Tel Aviv and its suburbs and Ben Gurion Airport, claiming civilian lives, causing hundreds of injuries, and damaging residential and commercial property. Mr. President, Excellencies, even wars have rules. First and foremost, civilians must be protected. Indiscriminate attacks and attacks against civilians and civilian property are violations of the laws of war. So are attacks against military objectives that cause disproportionate loss of civilian life and injury to civilians. There is no justification, including counterterrorism or self-defense, for the abdication by the parties to the conflict of their obligations under international humanitarian law. I urge the Israeli authorities to abide by the laws governing armed conflict, including the proportionate use of force. And I call on them to exercise maximum restraint in the conduct of military operations. I likewise urge Hamas and other militant groups to stop the indiscriminate launching of rockets and mortars from highly populated civilian neighborhoods into civilian population centers in Israel, also in clear violation of international humanitarian law. Densely populated civilian areas must not be used for military purposes. But above all, what we must, and I am repeating my appeal, what we must achieve is an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, Excellencies, I'm also deeply concerned by the continuation of violent clashes between Israeli security forces and Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where several Palestinian families are under the threat of eviction. These developments were preceded by weeks of tension, including around the holy sites. I urge Israel to cease demolitions and evictions in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, in line with its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. All settlement activities, including evictions and demolitions, are illegal under international law. Jerusalem is a holy city for 3 world religions. I underscore that the status quo at the holy sites must be upheld and respected. In Israel, communal violence and inflammatory rhetoric have added a further worrying dimension to the crisis. This localized violence has diminished over the past week, and I commend Jewish and Arab community leaders and civil society organizations for their positive contributions to peace. Furthermore, with every day that passes, the risk that violence could spread beyond Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory increases. This conflict creates an environment that is ripe for exploitation by radicals and extremists. We must prevent at all costs the emergence of a new locus of dangerous instability in the region. It is imperative that we achieve de-escalation to prevent an uncontainable cross-border security and humanitarian crisis. Mr. President, Excellencies, United Nations officials, including my Special Coordinator for the Middle East process and myself, are undertaking extensive diplomatic efforts within the region, including with Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, and with key partners in the international community to encourage all sides to halt the violence. We are engaging directly with the parties to conflict, including Hamas, in our efforts to secure an end to hostilities. I commend the ongoing efforts of member states aimed at encouraging all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate tensions, prevent further civilian casualties, and reach cessation of hostilities. And I call on all members of the international community to do everything in their power to enable the parties to conflict to step back from the brink. And I call on the parties themselves to allow for mediation efforts to intensify in order to bring the fighting to an end. These horrific events did not arise in isolation. They must be viewed in the context of decades of military occupation, political deadlock, grievances and hopelessness, and the failure to address the core issues at the heart of the conflict. We know far too well that violence begets violence. The unconscionable deaths, suffering and destruction of the past 10 days only serve to push the prospect of sustained peace further into the future. A revitalized peace process is the only route to a just and lasting solution. It is imperative that we keep this long-term vision alive. It starts by replacing anger and disillusionment with hope for a future in which both Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace and security. We must work towards a resumption of negotiations that will address the status of Jerusalem and other final status issues, end the occupation, and allow for the realization of a two-state solution on the basis of 1967 lines, UN resolutions, international law and mutual agreements, with Jerusalem as capital of both Israel and Palestine. The United Nations is deeply committed to working with Israelis and Palestinians and with our international and regional partners, including through the Middle East Quartet, to realize a lasting and just peace. Only through renewing our commitment and redoubling our efforts towards a negotiated solution can we bring this cruel violence and hatred to a definitive end. And I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Riyad al-Malki, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Observer State of Palestine.
معالي رئيس الجمعية العامة، معالي الأمين العام، معالي الوزراء، السيدات والسادة، تحمل جلسة اليوم والتي قمتم بعقدها مشكورين بطلب من المجموعة العربية والإسلامية ودول عدم الانحياز وبمشاركة عدد كبير من وزراء خارجية الدول العربية والإسلامية وممثلين عن دول العالم أجمع، رسالة واضحة تقول: أوقفوا المجزرة. سيد الرئيس، تستهدف إسرائيل المدججة بالسلاح العائلات في منامها لترهب شعبنا، ولا تدعي أنها أخطأت أو تعتذر، بل تؤكد أن من حقها ارتكاب هذه الجرائم وقتل الأبرياء وتحمل الضحية المسؤولية. حتى هذه اللحظة قتلت إسرائيل 230 فلسطيني، منهم 65 طفل و40 سيدة و15 مسن. دمرت أكثر من 1500 شقة سكنية و50 مدرسة، والأعداد في ازدياد مع استمرار.
Numbers are increasing as Israel continues its aggression. Israel has also displaced 100,000 Palestinians during the pandemic, in a blatant violation of international law and the Secretary General's call to stop conflicts during the pandemic. To those who say that Israel has the right to defend itself, what right are you exactly talking about? Israel is a colonization power. It is occupying our land. It is persecuting a whole people. Israel would ask you, what would you have done if missiles were targeting your cities? But Israel forgets that its occupation is the root cause of the violence. So I would like to ask you, what would you do if your territory is occupied, if your people were displaced, if your people were killed, detained, arrested, and persecuted? How can an occupying power have the right to defend itself when a whole people under occupation is deprived of the very same right? How can some rush to issue statements to condemn the killing of one Palestinian at a time when the whole world stays silent and turns a blind eye to the genocide of whole Palestinian families? Mr. President, the Palestinian people commemorates its Nakba at a time when it faces further torture and oppression, as it has done in the past 70 years. We are facing many disasters and Nakbas. We made sacrifices, we were displaced, we were patient, we struggled, we became martyrs, and we were arrested to defend our history, our nation, and our holy sites. However, not a single day did we let go of our national objectives as stipulated in resolutions of international legitimacy. We have never let go of our struggle. However, Israel, the occupying power, is repeating the same crimes in Sheikh al-Jarrah today in occupied Jerusalem. It is trying once again to displace forcibly Palestinian families in order to erase any Arab Palestinian presence in the city. This aggression is taking place with the participation of the Israeli government, the occupation army, the Israeli courts, settlers, and extremists. Israel, the occupying power, spared no effort in the past decades to obliterate the Islamic and Christian Arab-Palestinian identity of Jerusalem, to displace its people, to smother it with settlements, to divide Al-Haram, Al-Sharif in place and in time. It continues its war against the deeply rooted Palestinian presence in the Holy City. House after house, it escalated these policies, these systematic policies in the past years. Its decision to break into one of the holiest places, the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque, in one of the holiest months, the holy Ramadan, and one of the holiest nights, the night of Al-Qadr, is a case in point of these attempts which failed and will continue to fail. However, Jerusalem responded, as always, to those who said and pretended that they have unified Jerusalem by their occupation, to those who said that they can make peace in the Middle East without our people and on its expense. We responded to those who gave a promise to the occupier to gift it Jerusalem. We said that Jerusalem is not for sale. We responded to those who wanted to divide our Al-Aqsa, that we have that people will protect Al-Aqsa. And we do not care about a promise by those who do not own to those who do not deserve. We reaffirm the importance and the need to respect the current legal and historic status of Al-Haram al-Sharif. We reaffirm the important role of Jordan and the Hashemite protection of the holy places in the city. Mr. President, we have accepted international legitimacy and the international law to solve our question. We accepted political work and peaceful resistance as a way to solve the final issues and reach a peace agreement which would end occupation and the conflict. However, the occupation power, Israel, continues to procrastinate since the Oslo Accords. Not only that, the current Israeli government does not even believe in the two-state solution. It continues its annexation policies. It continues its colonization of our occupied land. It issues racist laws. It isolates Gaza Strip and violates all political, economic, and security agreements signed with it. The international law is the cornerstone of the international order. It does not tolerate any duplication and any false interpretation. Dealing with Israel as a country above the law will only encourage it to act as such. It is high time for the international community to shoulder its responsibilities to end the Israeli occupation of our land, of our holy sites, of our presence and our future. It is high time to take practical measures to provide international protection to the Palestinian people until they can actually practice their right to self-determination, their right to freedom and independence on their occupied land since 1967 with East Jerusalem as a capital. We urge you to honor your commitments under the international law, including not to acknowledge the illegal status created by Israeli procedures and policies in occupied Palestine, including East Jerusalem. We call upon you not to provide any assistance or support to entrench and maintain the current status. We call upon you to differentiate between Israel, the occupying power, and the occupied territories and ensure accountability. Every country in the world has the responsibility to ensure that peace, justice, and freedom prevail. It is your right to hold Israel accountable and not to provide it with arms. It is your responsibility to contribute to providing protection to the victims, not immunity to war criminals. It is your responsibility to fight settlements, not those who boycott them. It is your responsibility to be a support to a people persecuted in deed and words. The world should not be should not simply watch and stand idly by. You should stop these crimes. Mr. President, from this rostrum, from the United Nations, whose charter ensures the right of people to self-determination, and in front and before the representatives of states which achieved their independence after apartheid and occupation, we would like to tell you that our people shall not waver their right and their place among nations. We salute your solidarity with us. After your own struggles and history and principles, we saw how people of the world took to the streets in thousands and even millions to defend freedom and humanity, to say to the Israeli occupation, stop, enough is enough. Some would accuse the United Nations of siding with Palestinians at a time when it is siding with its charter. It is siding with rights, with the struggle of people to achieve their independence and freedom. The bias which should we fight is any bias that ensures impunity and guarantees impunity to Israel. These wars would never have been launched had the occupation taken responsibility of its different crimes, including oppressing demonstrations and its repeated aggressions in 2009, 2012, and 2014. After long decades of oppression, racial discrimination, and displacement. Mr. President, we call for peace. We are working for peace. However, this cannot come at the expense of our people and its right guaranteed by resolutions of international legitimacy. Ending occupation against our people and our holy sites should be followed by a political process in line with UN terms of reference, with an international sponsorship, which would lead to ending the Israeli occupation of Palestine and its capital. This is what we have informed the US administration and the quartet after the end of term of the Trump administration and its shameful deal, which pretended that Palestine is no longer a critical and central question. However, the events today reaffirm the importance and centrality of Jerusalem and the Palestinian cause at the regional and international level. But at what expense? Really, at what expense? The occupation targets our people generation after generation. This criminal Israeli occupation has caused so much pain which cannot be solved by a truce and a ceasefire. Susie, a child, went to sleep in her house in Gaza with her mother, father, and 4 siblings. She woke up the next day under the rubble, without a mother, with only one father. Samira and the trees planted by her father in their house's garden in Sheikh Jarrah after the Nakba are still under the threat of forced displacement. Muhammad, who loves running, who loves riding his bike, is today in a prison cell, being deprived of his childhood. Those who want peace have to win for those people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Observer State of Palestine. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mohammed bin Abdurrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Qatar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the merciful, the Almighty, distinguished President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Excellencies, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, allow me at the outset to express my thanks to the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations for having convened this urgent official meeting to debate a very important issue that requires an immediate and adequate response from the General Assembly and the international community. We also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his statement. Mr. President, the grave situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and particularly East Jerusalem, and the bombings on the Gaza Strip targeting innocent civilians and their homes and claiming dozens of lives, including women and children. All this requires that the international community act promptly to put an end to Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to prevent the recurrence of such events, as well as to respect the protection of the Hashemite kingdom over the mosque. Qatar has repeatedly warned about the Judaization policies of East Jerusalem, and we have warned about any attacks on holy places and above all Al-Haram al-Sharif. However, despite the condemnation of the international community in recent years of attempts of the Israeli government and people to carry out aggression against the Palestinian people and expel them from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, despite this, the settlement activity is continuing, and it has taken on a scale that can be described as ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. There have been numerous attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli authorities. They have no respect for the sanctity of the month of Ramadan, which has led to the escalation of the situation. The state of Qatar reiterates its rejection and condemnation of aggression on the part of Israeli police and settlers against the citizens of Jerusalem, and we condemn the ongoing violence against innocent civilians. We also condemn incursions and aggression against worshippers by Israeli actors. It goes without saying that these illegitimate practices, which some describe as war crimes, are a provocation towards millions of Muslims and a flagrant violation of human rights, international conventions and treaties, and the very principles of humanity. In light of recent developments, we would like to underscore the need to respect international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. The use of excessive, disproportionate force against civilians must cease, and in this connection, we condemn the indiscriminate strikes against the Gaza Strip, which have claimed numerous victims, and particularly the attack on the Al-Shati camp, which has claimed dozens of civilian lives, including 10 members of one single family. Residential buildings and neighborhoods continue to be targeted, and this has claimed the lives of dozens of children. We likewise condemn and reject the targeting of the Red Cross building in Gaza. We also confirm that targeting media and medical facilities is a flagrant violation of international law. We firmly oppose this, and we ask, when will the international community act to protect international law and the provocative unilateral policy of Israel as it attempts to change the demographic composition of the city of Jerusalem and continue its settlement policies? The international community must ensure that the sanctity of holy sites is respected. What is currently happening and the inaction is undermining the authority of the United Nations and its ability to maintain international peace and security. And in this respect, we call on the international community to take its responsibility seriously and urgently and immediately protect the Palestinian people by putting an end to Israeli aggression and all illegitimate practices so that the Palestinian people may once again enjoy its legitimate rights, including its religious observances. Mr. President, Qatar's position has always been one that supports all sincere and honest efforts to make real progress in settling the conflict in the Middle East. And in light of recent escalations, we have taken swift steps on the basis of our conviction regarding the importance of the peaceful settlement of disputes, including dialogue and mediation. We have undertaken intensive diplomatic efforts in coordination with the United Nations and other stakeholders on the international level. And in this context, Qatar would like to express its appreciation for the laudable efforts made by brotherly countries in order to achieve a de-escalation and a ceasefire on the Palestinian territories. And we would like to particularly mention Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, who is a non-permanent member of the Security Council, as well as the United States. And here we would like to once again urge the international community to participate in full seriousness in this process, and especially those who can act effectively to bring peace to the Middle East in order to protect holy sites and put an end to all attempts to expel and displace Palestinians in the occupied territories, and to not allow extremist groups to control the situation on the ground. We must also maximize and accelerate efforts to rebuild the Gaza Strip and open up access to aid agencies. Current events must incite the international community to work towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian issue in order to establish a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital on the basis of 1967 lines in accordance with the two-state solution. And the resolutions of the International Quartet, as well as the Arab Peace Initiative, in order to put an end to this deplorable situation and have a positive impact on peace and stability in the region and the world. And in conclusion, we express our solidarity with the brotherly people of Palestine in its just fight, and we reaffirm our constant position regarding the legitimacy of the Palestinian question and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Qatar for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ayman Safadi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, dear colleagues, peace be upon you. 65 children, 39 mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters were killed since Israel waged its aggression on Gaza on the 10th of this month. And every day, without the international community shouldering its responsibilities and ending the aggression, parents lose their children and children lose their parents. 100 airstrikes are carried out by 52 warplanes against the besieged Gaza Strip in 25 minutes. Innocent people are killed, the homes of unarmed civilians are demolished, their rights are violated, and their hopes of safe homes, schools, and clinics are killed. In 11 days, the Israeli aggression displaced around 75,000 people in Gaza, most of whom took shelter in the schools of UNRWA, most of which are unable to provide them with humanitarian assistance. We should continue to provide financial support to UNRWA. Enough enough killing, enough destruction, enough violations of the international law, the UN Charter, and the international legitimacy resolutions, as well as human rights. Enough killing of hope and perpetuation of despair and tampering with the future of the region. The Israeli practices are pushing the region towards more conflicts and deny all the nations of the region the rights to security and peace, and they undermine international peace and security. The United Nations should immediately act to safeguard its charter, its resolutions. The international community should immediately act in order to end the aggression against Gaza and to reach a ceasefire and to compel Israel, the occupying power, to end its breach of the international law and its raids in the occupied Al-Quds and its sanctuaries and in other occupied Palestinian territories, and should provide protection for the Palestinian people. The Israeli occupation has turned Al-Quds, Jerusalem, the city of peace, into an arena of oppression, suppression, and injustice, provoking the sentiments of around 1 billion Muslims through their raids in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa or Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram al-Sharif, the total area of which 144 dunams is an exclusive place of worship for Muslims. Israel violates the rights of Palestinians to their homes in an attempt to alter their Arabo-Islamic and Christian identity. The displacement of the population of Sheikh Jarrah will be a war crime. Those Palestinian citizens have clear rights to their homes, where they were born, where they lived, and where their parents and grandparents lived. What kind of obscurantism that denies them that right? In accordance with international law, the Al-Quds residents are protected population in accordance with Security Council Resolution 478 of 1980. The occupation has no authority or rule over them. Defending the rights of Sheikh Jarrah residents is a defense of the international law and our common human values. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan will continue to defend the people of Sheikh Jarrah and their rights through all possible means and in coordination with our brethren in the state of Palestine. Jordan will continue to deploy all its resources to protect Al-Quds population and to defend Al-Quds and preserving the Arabo-Islamic and Christian identity of the sanctuaries in the occupied Al-Quds, and also protecting the existing historical and legal status therein will continue to be the priority of the custodian, His Majesty King Abdullah II, who continue to reiterate that Al-Quds is a red line and tampering with Al-Quds and its sanctuary is playing with fire. The kingdom will continue to exert every effort and to work with brethren and partners to end occupation and to achieve all the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, notably the right to freedom and sovereign independent state with the occupied Al-Quds, Jerusalem, as its capital on the borders of the 4th of June 1967 in order to have just and comprehensive peace. This serious escalation should come to an end. Israel is responsible for this escalation. This is the immediate priority. And the way to achieve this is to immediately end the aggression and all Israeli practices that caused this escalation, and to reach a ceasefire that ends this deadly cycle of violence. And the efforts, the international community should concert its efforts to end this historical injustice visited on the Palestinian people. If left unchecked, there will be more serious escalations and the whole region will remain a hostage of the conflict in every minute. Occupation is the source of all evil. Ending occupation is the only way to achieve peace. Israel will not enjoy security if it continues to deny Palestinians that security. And Israel and the whole region will not enjoy peace if the Palestinians continue to be denied peace. Israel undermines the prospects for peace by the construction and expansion of settlements, confiscation of land and demolition of homes, as well as displacement of population. Israel also continues to attempt to change the legal and historical status in the holy places and alter the demographic composition in Al-Quds and in the occupied West Bank. There is more than 700,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, compared to 500,000 in 2010 and 370,000 in 2000. The construction of illegal settlements continues in an unprecedented pace, and this undermines the two-state solution, which the whole world agreed to as a way to achieve comprehensive and just peace. Killing the two-state solution leads to the inevitable one-state solution, and this begs the question, is it a state that guarantees equal rights for all its population, or in an apartheid regime? It is an illusion to think of achieving peace, stability, and security under an apartheid regime. Without finding genuine horizons for ending the occupation and ending this injustice, as well as achieving comprehensive and just peace that meets the aspirations of the nations of the region on the basis of the two-state solution and in accordance with the international law, this an escalation will follow another in a deadly cycle of violence. Either we end this cycle of violence that will threaten international peace and security and lead to a breach of the charter of our organization every few years, or an immediate action to address the basis and the root causes of the conflict in terms of injustice, oppression, and occupation, to restore hope and to reach just and comprehensive peace, which the region and its nations deserve. This is a strategic choice and a regional and international necessity. Dear colleagues, the choice should be clear, and it is high time to act. I thank you, and peace be upon you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sabri Boukaddoum, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Algeria, speaking on behalf of the Arab Group.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Arab Group, allow me to express our deep thanks to you, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, for quickly responding to the request by the Arab Group and the OIC to hold this emergency session. This meeting is being held at a time when our Palestinian brothers are going through tragic circumstances caused by the violent crimes perpetrated by the occupation powers against a people whose only fault is refusing to abide by to accept the policy of fait accompli. We all saw the graphic images of killing and destructions. We followed the attacks targeting the lives of Palestinians and their holy sites in occupied Jerusalem. We witnessed the barbaric raids which saw the seas of terror and death in besieged Gaza. Is it possible to stay silent behind our screens after everything we saw? Counting victims, especially children, women, and old people, and witnessing the huge destruction to the infrastructure. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine just gave us the numbers. It is possible, after everything we saw, to just listen to flowery speeches justifying the disgraceful silence and inaction by the Security Council, and to those equating the aggressor. Undoubtedly, Mr. President, any attempt to falsify the reality and to turn the table will definitely fail. We have irrefutable evidence that houses were being destroyed while innocent civilians were inside them. We have irrefutable evidence of all forms of oppression and violations of human rights. Undoubtedly, the impunity given to the occupation will only exacerbate the situation, complicate it. It only serves the interests of very few people. Mr. President, this joint initiative by the Arab Group and the OIC, which was later supported by the non-aligned movement, is based on the fact that we want to urge our organization to shoulder its responsibilities based on the Charter. As the Security Council fails to take a stance regarding these tragic events, the Arab Group believes it is important for the General Assembly to act swiftly to adopt practical steps to reach a comprehensive cessation of violence against Palestinians and to use all available tools to protect them and protect their holy sites. Based on that, the Arab Group believes that the gravity of the situation requires collective efforts to ensure an immediate cessation of hostilities and to immediately address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in all occupied Palestinian territories. We need to provide the necessary circumstances to resume the peace process, to address the root causes of the conflict by ending the occupation of all Palestinian territories in line with relevant terms of reference. The Arab Group expects everyone to clearly and expressly condemn the systematic killing of Palestinians without any duplication. We expect everyone to hold accountable the perpetrators of crimes against innocent civilians. We call upon the Secretary General of the United Nations to declare a state of emergency, a state of humanitarian emergency, to allow the international community to effectively alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians and to take steps to reconstruct Gaza, which is suffering under occupation for the past 15 years. Mr. President, these painful events remind us once again of the reality of the suffering of the Palestinian people, which continue to be occupied and besieged. We salute their attachment to their legitimate rights. We reaffirm that the United Nations has not done enough, especially the Security Council. It has not done enough to find a just, comprehensive solution to the Palestinian cause, which is only fuming the flames of instability at the regional and international level. We have to start calling things by their names. The occupation of Palestinian territories and other Arab territories will always remain an occupation. This occupation will continue to lead to the worst violations. The Palestinian question can only be solved by addressing the root causes of the conflict, namely by ending the occupation of Palestinian territories and allowing Palestinian people to practice their inalienable right to self-determination and establish their independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as a capital. In this regard, we reaffirm that Al-Quds al-Sharif, Holy Jerusalem, it remains occupied. It will always remain forever the capital of Palestine. It will remain an integral part of occupied Palestine. We stress the need to preserve the historic and legal status of Jerusalem and its holy sites, including Al-Aqsa Mosque. Mr. President, 76 years ago, the United Nations was established. Ever since, the Palestinian question has always been one of the items on its agenda. Hundreds of resolutions were adopted, and all these resolutions have stressed the right of the Palestinian people, their inalienable right to self-determination, independence, sovereignty, and the right of Palestinians to return to their homes and property. However, the historic justice inflicted upon the Palestinians remains until today. Promises were not implemented, and Palestinians continue to be displaced. Their land and property continue to be taken away. Where are we today? Have we implemented Resolution 181, which provided for the division of Jerusalem with a detailed map? Where are we today after the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Accords? Where are we today after we adopted hundreds of resolutions by the General Assembly and dozens of resolutions in the Security Council, starting with Resolution 242 of 1967 until the latest resolution, 2334 in 2016. Where are we today? Have we implemented all that? During that period, the occupying power continued to occupy more than 85% of Palestinian territories at a time when Jerusalem is victim to campaigns of displacement and destruction, targeting the obliteration of its identity. So we firmly believe that there can be no solution to the Palestinian question without us all taking a courageous position to end two things, namely impunity and the occupation of Palestinian territories. Thank you for listening.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Algeria for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, esteemed delegates. Let me begin by thanking the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for his leadership